Hello everyone, welcome to Chapter 2. Chapter 2 deals with communication and identity. And as many of you are probably aware of, we have multiple aspects to our identity. Our identity is something that we learn about through our interactions with other people, and our identity shapes the way in which we approach communication with others and the way that we approach relationships with other people. So ideas about identity, the way that we view ourselves, and all of these issues tend to play a central role in interpersonal communication and relationships, which is one of the reasons why we spend time talking about identity. But furthermore, identity is important because when we look at issues of self-perception, self-esteem, expectations that we might have for ourselves, things like that, it starts to allow us to understand on a deeper level the relationship that we have with ourselves. And that is a type of relationship that many of us don't think so much about. In classes like these, we tend to talk more about relationships with other people. However, it seems pretty clear, and I'm sure that many of you agree with me on this, the identity that I have about myself and the relationship that I have with myself in terms of the way I view myself, the internal dialogue that I have going in my mind about the way that life is playing out, why things happen as they do, how I'm going to respond when things do happen, right? Those all are reflective of the relationship we have with ourselves, and that is something that definitely influences how we relate to other people. So in this chapter, we're going to be looking at the ideas that you have come to adopt or cultivate about yourself, where you learned those ideas, what ideas or what identity issues are things that are favorable or positive for you. And we're also going to explore the option or the possibility that maybe there are some ideas about yourself that you might be holding on to, which potentially could be outdated or maybe not true. And if that's the case, then you can think about potentially modifying some of the impressions that you have about yourself so that you can more effectively approach interactions with other people. Let's get started. Communication and self-concept. One of the main things that we want to be aware of in terms of our self-concept is that the self-concept is something that is developed fairly early on in life, and it continues to develop throughout the course of one's life, depending on your life achievements, depending on your relationships with people, things like that. And the self-concept is something that we often tend to learn about through our interactions with other people, specifically people who are important to us, so significant people in our lives. For most of us, what this means is that we have come to learn about who we are through the ideas and beliefs and attitudes of parents, caregivers, older siblings, other important people in our lives, things like that. And so the self-concept, generally speaking, can be understood by thinking about the beliefs or the convictions that you have about who you are. So when people say things like, well, I consider myself to be somebody who has integrity, or I consider myself to be a loving, kind person. These are all ideas that we might have about who we are and how we behave. So the self-concept could include lots of varied aspects of how we see ourselves. It could deal with our personal identity in terms of who we are. It could deal with the way that we approach things like career or educational achievements. So some people have a self-concept that they see themselves as very achievement-oriented. Okay, that would be a type of self-concept. Other people might not view themselves as achievement-oriented. Maybe they view themselves as more laid back, go with the flow kind of person. Okay, these are various examples of types of ideas that could be included in somebody's self-concept. So I encourage you all to think about your self-concept. What are some of the beliefs that you have about yourself? What are some of the ideas that you hold to be true about who you are, what your skills are, and what your values are, and things like that? Now, in comparison to self-concept, we also have self-esteem. Now, the self-concept tends to be more based on ideas related to who I am, okay? So I am someone who values family relationship. I am someone who works hard. I am someone who wants to go and get an education so that I can enjoy a high quality of life later on, right? Those are ideas about ourselves. Self-esteem, on the other hand, is related to how we feel about ourselves, okay? So self-esteem is more related to how we feel about ourselves, or do we feel positively or favorably about who we are? Do we have a positive attitude about who we are? So people who have high self-esteem tend to value themselves. They view themselves as lovable, right? Worthy of love from other people. People with high self-esteem tend to have confidence. They tend to have a sense of security, and they believe that they can achieve the things that they set forth in life, right? On the other hand, some of us have struggled with self-esteem in our lives. Okay, I have also struggled with this. Not so much now in my 30s, but when I was a teenager and maybe in my 20s, I would say that self-concept and self-esteem were definitely areas that I had to take a look at, start to understand, start to see, where did I get these messages about myself? Do these messages hold true, or are they outdated or just simply incorrect, right? And what things am I really good at in life? What are some things that maybe I'm not the best at, but I can improve on, right? So self-esteem is basically how we feel about our competence, how we feel about ourselves. Do we value ourselves? Do we see ourselves as lovable? And then self-concept clearly is related to self-esteem, okay? But generally speaking, we can view the self-concept as something that is more related to cognitive ideas about ourselves, right? So I am a hard worker, or I value education, right? Things like that. And self-esteem is how we feel about ourselves, okay? So I feel that I can achieve goals that I set forth in my life, right? That would be a high self-esteem attitude. So you can distinguish between those two, and I encourage you to think about your own self-concept. Think about what beliefs you hold to be true. Where did you get those beliefs about yourself? Were they cultivated by parents, siblings, bosses, community leaders, things like that? And do you think that those ideas that you have about yourself are accurate? And if not, what are some potential areas where you might want to modify some of those ideas that you're carrying around about yourself so that you can be more effective and happy in your life, okay? So for each of us, this type of self-concept, self-esteem issue is different. And so each of us really is in charge of exploring it and determining, what areas perhaps we may need to work on and modify depending on how our current self-concept and self-esteem is working for us. Okay, so please do think about that. And of course, if you have any questions about any of these issues, I'm happy to discuss them with you further. So please feel free to use me as your resource. With regards to self-concept and self-esteem, the book distinguishes between positive cycles and negative cycles. Okay, so positive cycles are those kinds of cycles in which our self-concept and our self-esteem serve us positively, right? They enable us to go out and achieve things in our lives that we want to achieve. Negative cycles, on the other hand, tend to detract from our ability to achieve the things that we want in life. And we're going to go into the self-fulfilling prophecy and the Pygmalion effect here in a few minutes. But just for the intro on this idea, it's just important to be aware of the fact that, generally speaking, people who have a positive self-concept and higher self-esteem tend to be more capable of evoking positive cycles in their life in terms of the thoughts they have, how they feel, how that influences behaviors, right? Because we know that there is a definite connection between the thoughts we have, the feelings we have, and of course, how we end up behaving, right? So start to think about that. Start to think about whether you tend to use positive cycles in your life, or maybe you've noticed that you tend to have negative cycles in terms of the self-fulfilling prophecy. What's wonderful about these issues is that when you develop some knowledge about the terminology and the ideas, then you can start to go inward and start to analyze yourself and figure out, are there things that I want to work on so that I can be a happier, healthier person? And that's what's really wonderful about taking classes like this, is that when we take a class like this, we develop knowledge about the world and about ourselves in particular. And that knowledge gives us power to modify or to change or to alter the trajectory that we're on in life. Okay? So think about these positive cycles and negative cycles. And we're going to go into the prophecies in a few moments here. But before we do that, we're going to talk about various traits of biology and the self in terms of personality. So according to your textbook, there are 5 major personality traits. These personality traits tend to influence who we are, how we see the world, how we behave and communicate with people. And these 5 personality traits tend to exist on a spectrum, right? So for example, there is a spectrum of introverted versus extroverted. You can imagine your own identity, for example, or your own sense of self as existing on a spectrum, right? And maybe to the far left, you have people who are introverts, and then to the far right, you have people who are extroverts. So introverts are people who tend to process things internally more than externally. And of course, if you are an internal processor, what that means is that rather than figuring out how you feel by talking to people, you are probably more likely to process things in your own mind and figure out how you feel by yourself, and then you probably communicate about it with other people once you have figured that out. Extroverts, on the other hand, tend to process things externally. So I myself consider myself to be an extrovert. A lot of the time, I will notice that when I'm in a conversation with people who I trust and who I can communicate with, those kinds of conversations help me to figure out how I feel about something by talking it through, right? In addition, a major difference between introverts and extroverts is that introverts tend to gain energy and strength, and they tend to gather their energy through time alone. They find time alone to be very rewarding to them. On the other hand, people who are extroverts tend to gain energy or excitement from interacting with people, right? So now it's very obvious based on the people that you know in life, usually who the extroverts are and who the introverts are. And it's also possible that depending on the situation, you might be extroverted in one situation and fairly introverted in another situation. So one of my friends claims to be extroverted when she's in a conversation with 1 or 2 people, but when she gets in front of a group of people, she says that she is introverted and she gets nervous. So you can think about your own sense of identity and where you fall on that. So extrovert, introvert is the first major personality trait. The second one is being open versus not being open. All of us probably know people who are very private individuals, right? People who are private tend to exist more on the spectrum of not being open. What this means is that these kinds of people are not comfortable sharing private information about themselves with others until they get to know people. And even then, they may be very selective about what they choose to share. On the other hand, some of us tend to be very open about who we are, what our life is, what our personality is about, what our dreams are, what our goals are, okay? And so as you can probably guess, these types of personality traits, whether you're open or not open, play a pretty significant role in how people communicate, right? It also can influence the trajectory that a relationship will go through in terms of development. So for example, you could think about maybe a couple, and let's say that one of the people in the relationship is extremely open and the other person is extremely private. And of course, the person who's open is going to want to share things about themselves, and they're probably also going to want to know things about the other person that's also private, right? Because one of the things that we know about relationships is that information disclosure tends to be reciprocal. So what that means is if I sit down with you, for example, and I tell you a fairly detailed story about my past and some challenges that I went through and how that shaped who I became. And then in response, you just say to me, "Oh, wow, that's nice. Thanks for sharing." There's going to be an imbalance in that conversation, right? Because reciprocal sharing has to do with the fact that if I share some information with you, then in order for the relationship or the conversation to feel balanced, you need to then turn around and share some information with me, right? And then that way we both feel like we shared information with each other. We've both, exposed ourselves a little bit, if you will. And so this idea of being open versus not open really can influence relationships. And it's something to think about in terms of your own relationships. Also, the extrovert-introvert dynamic is something worth considering. I'll give a little personal example here, but my husband is a classic introvert, okay? He's a computer engineer type. He loves spending time, doing his reading his phone on the computer, kind of just quiet time alone. That's how he gains his energy, and that's how he, rejuvenates, is through quiet time alone. Myself, I'm an extrovert. So, of course, what do I want to do when he comes home from work? I want to talk, right? I want to interact. I want to share everything that happened during my day. I want to tell him stories about this and about that. And sometimes what I've noticed is that, because I tend to be talkative and extroverted, I've noticed sometimes that my husband, after we've been talking or interacting for a while, I can start to actually tell by reading his nonverbal cues. I can start to tell when he is starting to be tired out with the conversation, right? So I'll start to read his nonverbals, and I can see, but based on his facial expressions and his eyes and, the way that he looks, I can tell when he's sort of, extroverting out, if you will, like, he's in the place where he's, we've been talking for a while. We've been interacting all day. I've been telling him stories and ideas. He's a good listener, obviously. Most introverts tend to be good listeners as well, right? And fortunately for us extroverts, there are introverts in the world, because introverts play a very important role in the world, right? And there's actually a book that was written on the power of the introverted personality in the modern world. And so you could probably look that up if you're interested in learning more about it. But I will actually start to notice when my husband is starting to feel tired out by interacting. And so when I start to see those nonverbal cues, then what I do is I say, "Oh, it looks like you need some time to yourself. Okay, well, I'll go off and work out, or I'll go to call somebody that I can extrovert with on the phone," whatever it is that, that I need to do to feel comfortable. But I can tell when he needs to have some time to himself. And so, I'll try to pick up on that cue, and I'll try to truncate the conversation, and then we can, of course, interact again later on when he's had some time to rejuvenate through his introverted leisure, right? Introverted sort of quiet time, right? Okay, so we have extrovert, introvert. We have open, not open. We have people who are conscientious and undirected. Conscientious people are these people who have a plan, and sometimes they have more than one plan. And conscientious people like to have a list because they want to stay focused and they want to stay organized because they want to get their plan done, right? Undirected people tend to go with the flow. They tend to be more laid back about when things get done, how they get done. They tend to not have such a motivation to accomplish things in life. The conscientious people tend to be more highly motivated, in my opinion, to go after maybe, let's say, career pursuits or academic pursuits that require many years of training or education or whatever. So conscientious, again, undirected, different types of personality traits, right? And a lot of us exist somewhere, in the middle, right? Like, for example, I don't think that I am the most extroverted person I've ever met, right? I don't think I'm the most open person I've ever met. And I'm certainly not the most conscientious person I've ever met, although I am fairly conscientious, okay? But you can think of these things on a paradigm, and most people, it's like a bell curve, right? Most people tend to fall within a couple of standard deviations from the bell curve, which is sort of the middle mark. So people that are conscientious and undirected tend to have different desires for accomplishments and ways to achieve those things, right? So you can think about how those issues play out in relationships as well. I guarantee you that these personality traits definitely influence how people communicate, the needs that they have in relationships, and the overall interactive outcomes. So it's worth paying attention to where you fall on these different types of traits. And also, if you have a significant other that you're in a relationship with, or if you have friends or family members that you're in relationships with, it's worth considering where they fall on these different traits as well, so that you can start to understand them a little bit more. And then that way you can be more sensitive to their needs, right? So I gave the example of my husband being an introvert and me being an extrovert. The reason that I cue into him in terms of like him needing some time alone, for example, is because I've learned over the course of our relationship, and we've been together about 7 years now, and we've been married for 4, and I've learned through the course of the relationship that he needs time to himself in order to truly be the best husband that he can be to me, okay? And also, I care about him feeling comfortable. I want him to feel peaceful and comfortable, like his needs are being met. I don't want to feel as if, you know, he's constantly trying to meet my needs, but his needs are not being met, because as we know, relationships need to be reciprocal, which means that when we commit to each other, we both commit to doing our absolute best to help meet the needs of both the other person and ourselves in the relationship, right? So this idea of conscientious and undirected, open, not open, extrovert, introvert, definitely worth considering. Another type of personality trait is the trait of agreeable versus antagonistic. So people who are agreeable tend to be fairly agreeable, for lack of a better word. They tend to be willing to kind of go along with the flow, okay? They don't tend to have very fixed ideas about how things should be at all times. They also tend to want to shy away from arguments, okay? So if you're an agreeable person, you're much more likely to try to keep the peace, or give in to keep the peace, or to try to maybe emphasize the similarities in relationships so that you can keep the peace. On the other hand, other people tend to be fairly antagonistic or argumentative, right? So for some people, being right is very, very important, right? And we all know people like this. And sometimes you might be having a conversation with people or someone, and you're trying to tell a larger story, and they start to harp or start to fixate on one detail of the story that you shared, and start to discuss whether that detail is correct, or whether, you know, is this really true? Was there really that much traffic on the freeway today? I don't know, you know. And the whole point is, well, I'm trying to tell you a story. I'm not really, you know, I don't really need you to dissect this one detail to see if it's correct. But for some people, they tend to be more argumentative, and so they might fixate on areas of the conversation where they feel that they have to argue a point. In addition, these kinds of traits tend to be socialized in the family system. So for example, I know some people who have come from family systems where the norm for interacting had to do a lot with debating points all the time, debating whether one person is correct or not, debating whether that's the correct way to go to the beach or not, debating, you know, how we're going to approach this issue, and is that the right way or not, right? So sometimes this is a socialized cultural thing that people are trained to be like in the family system. But I have to emphasize that when you have a relationship with someone who is argumentative or antagonistic, it can be very, very draining, and it can really wear on you emotionally over time. Also, if you have someone in the family system who is argumentative, antagonistic, or if they're constantly trying to say how right they are, or if they're constantly trying to one-up people in the family, that can be very destructive to the overall peace of the family system. So it's definitely worth considering where you fall on this trait, and also consider the relationships that you have with people and where they fall. Now, agreeable versus antagonistic, most of us are not, you know, we don't fall into categories that are that cut and dried, but certainly, and it may also be situations, like maybe there's certain situations where you tend to be more argumentative than others or whatever. But I definitely would consider this, because, you know, we don't really need to dissect this issue completely to understand that, you know, people who are antagonistic tend to cause more conflict, right? So you want to be conscious of this. You want to be especially conscious of your own traits and what types of situations maybe trigger you to become antagonistic. And clearly, all of us are going to be antagonistic at some level some of the time, right? But the goal in terms of a class like this is to learn about ourselves so that we can approach relationships with the most effective skill sets that we can to have happy, healthy relationships. So think about this, agreeable versus antagonistic. And finally, the biology in the self also identifies the personality trait of emotional diversity or emotional stability. Now, your book labels this trait as emotionally neurotic versus stable, but I have chosen to relabel it because the term neurotic, in my opinion, holds an extreme value judgment, which I don't think is effective in discussing these kinds of issues, because the reality is that every person has their own emotional experience in life, and that some people just experience much less emotion than other people, right? There are some of us that tend to experience our lives in fairly emotional ways. So when we're happy, we feel very happy. And when we're sad, we might feel more sad than the average person. But there also tends to be people who don't have a very developed or in-depth emotional experience. And so what that means for those people is that, things that someone else might find really upsetting, they just might find mildly disappointing, right? So think about where you fall on the emotional component as well. Emotions are the kinds of things that you can learn to manage. And so emotional intelligence is actually one of the new upcoming relevant terms that's being evoked in corporate organizational discussion. And some of the research coming out is showing that emotional intelligence is actually more important in terms of success with career and stuff than actual intelligence, brain intelligence, right? So emotional competence is important. Obviously, intelligence is important as well, but these basic traits are definitely worth considering. And also, one last point about this, where did you get these traits? Well, what the research shows in terms of biology and what we end up inheriting in life from our parents is that about 50% of our personality is inherited and about 50% is cultivated or socialized, okay? So about 50% of who you are, you probably got from your parents or your grandparents or other people in your family system in terms of, like, let's say extroverted personality or, being more emotional than, somebody else, things like that. But also we are socialized to be a certain way depending on how we are interacted with when we're young, okay? What's great about learning about these things is that if you decide that you want to modify some of these aspects of yourself, you can certainly work on that, and you can work to manage these kinds of tendencies too. If you feel as if there are certain tendencies that are causing you some issues, you can work to manage those things so that you're more effective in your personal relationships and professional interactions. So please do think about these. So there are several characteristics of self-concept that we want to be aware of. A few of these I've already mentioned before, but one of these is that the self-concept is subjective. And what does that mean? Well, what that means is that our self-concept is based on our perception of the world. It's subjective. It's not something that is objective, an objective, concrete fact, right? So for example, I can say, well, this table that's holding my computer that I'm lecturing on right now, I'm knocking on the table. I don't know if you can hear that. This is a hard table, right? I can say that. That's an objective fact. However, if I was to say to you, well, I see myself as a people person. Well, okay, what is a people person? What does that include? How do those people who like other people behave, right? It's a very subjective notion. So self-concept is subjective, and the thing about that is it's also subject to change, right? Depending on the experiences we go through in life. Now, one of the things about self-concept that we want to be aware of is this tendency that some of us have to self-enhance. So some people might actually think that they're pretty close to perfect, or they might think that they could try to become perfect. I don't think that any of you really think this. Most people probably don't think they're perfect, but occasionally, people may. However, self-enhancement can also play can also look different. It can also look like something as if, well, other people are always the ones who behave in ways that are negative in this relationship, right? I never do anything in the relationship that is negative. Well, I don't know that that is really even possible. I think that every person has their issues. Every person is going to struggle with certain issues in life. So if you find that you hear other people that you know saying things like, well, it's always their problem and I'm fine, and it's always somebody else's problem whenever there's an issue, there's a tendency to have this self-enhancing playing out, okay? So that's one of the things that we need to watch. Now, clearly, it's difficult or more difficult to point out the flaws that we have in ourselves than in other people, okay? So we want to just be aware of this, all right? And we want to make sure that we don't self-enhance so much that we struggle with relationships. A little bit of self-enhancement is probably good because, we live in a world that is, we get a lot of negative messages about ourselves just on a daily basis from the media and things like that, advertising companies, about how we should be buying products to make us look good or feel good or whatever. But we really want to be careful that we're not doing too much self-enhancement. And also, if you are in a relationship with someone who is always self-enhancing, it can really detract from the quality of the relationship, because what that means is that they're less likely to be able to take responsibility when things go wrong, right? Especially if they did something. A person who has self-enhancement issues will have a hard time admitting that they have done something that's negative. And so we want to be careful that we don't self-enhance too much. On the other hand, we also don't want to criticize ourselves too much, because that is a negative cycle to get in as well. So some of us are especially harsh on ourselves, and we want to not do this, because being harsh on yourself or being very, very self-critical is something that can really detract from your experience of life, your quality of life, but it also can detract from your ability to relate to other people, because you may have more problems in a relationship because of the self-criticism and the types of cycles that it creates in your mind, right? And of course, mind, emotion, behavior, they're all interconnected. So in addition, if you're in a relationship with someone who's highly self-critical, that may be challenging for you, because a lot of times if you're with someone who's highly self-critical, they might also be critical on you, and that can be challenging. It can also be a lot of energy to try to convince somebody all the time that they're not, behaving poorly, or that they are a good person, and that can be, kind of exhausting if you're constantly in a situation where you have to always lift somebody up. So as I talked about a few slides ago, one of the things that we want to be conscious of in this class is the relationship we have with ourselves. And when we look at self-enhancement and we look at self-criticism, what we know is that these are terms that deal with the relationship we have with ourselves, okay? So I encourage you to start to pay more attention to the internal dialogue that you have going, right? So the thoughts that you have on a daily basis about life, about yourself, about the world, about other people in relation to you in the world, what are those thoughts like? Can you decipher if there are 2 or 3 recurring themes that you tend to notice? Themes such as, you might notice if you start to pay attention to your internal dialogue that you are very self-critical. If that's the case, I strongly encourage you to look at where you developed that tendency. Usually it comes from a parent who is also very self-critical, and then we learn to criticize ourselves. So I encourage you, if you are, for example, very self-critical, I encourage you to look at where you developed that, how the influence played out, what the impact is on your overall emotional health and mental health and behavior, and start to think about things that are positive about yourself, and start to emphasize the positive things about yourself, so that you can, at the very least, balance out the criticism with positive, okay? This might take some getting used to, especially if you tend to have a fairly negative internal dialogue going about yourself, but I guarantee you that if you work on this, and sometimes you even have to enlist the help of a counselor to help you look at some of these issues, but I guarantee you that you can definitely improve and modify self-concept and self-esteem so that you are a happier person over time. Okay, so please do think about that. And doing that will only improve all of the relationships that you have with yourself, of course, and the people in your life. Now, self-enhancement and self-criticism is a type of distortion. And when we think about distortion, distortion is basically beliefs that we have today that are not true for various reasons. Perhaps the reasons are because the information is outdated. Maybe we have an image of ourselves when we were 15 years old that is no longer accurate, but yet because that was something that really played a part in our life back then, we might be holding on to that idea of ourselves. Another reason that we might have an obsolete or distorted idea of ourselves could be because of excessive feedback from other people when we were growing up or in relationships now. So, for example, people who receive excessive positive feedback from, let's say, their parents, but they do not receive, let's say, remediation or instruction, or in some cases, loving punishment based on behaviors that they do that are not appropriate. People who receive only positive feedback but do not get instruction or guidance from parents have the tendency, or there's a likelihood or possibility that they could develop a self-concept that is distorted, right? So it's possible that somebody like that might start to view themselves as nearly perfect, right? And of course, we've talked about the impact that distortion can have on relationships, right? So we want to think about that as well. And of course, negative feedback all the time can be very damaging. And so if you came from a home environment where there was a lot of criticism, then I strongly encourage you to take a look at these issues to try to improve your perception of yourself so that you can be a happier person. There also tends to be this myth of perfection that some people might try to adopt. And, this comes from all sorts of places. And I'm not really sure, in your own life, if you've even been exposed to this, or if you feel that you're trying to live up to some kind of myth of perfection that doesn't exist. But I'm here to tell you that perfection is impossible. And even the desire to be perfect is an indicator that there is some underlying issue underneath that's causing someone to feel that they have to achieve perfection in order to feel good about themselves, okay? So I reassure you, and I want to reassure you again, that nobody is perfect, and that each of us have areas about ourselves that are very positive and wonderful, and also all of us have areas probably that need to be worked on. So, the reality is that most of us are kind of a mixed bag, right? We have some traits that are very positive that really contribute a lot to our relationships and the world. We have other traits that are challenging for ourselves and other people to deal with, but we can work on this and we can improve. So think about these issues. Another major self-concept issue is that self-concept tends to resist change. What this means is that we might be dealing with situations today, for example, where the ideas we have about ourselves are no longer accurate. So, for example, sometimes, let's say that you know of someone who, when they were a teenager, they used to struggle with, carrying extra weight, right? So maybe they had some self-esteem issues when they were a teenager because they struggled to get their weight under control or whatever. And maybe as an adult, that very same person views themselves in a negative way. They don't view themselves as attractive because they still see themselves as, unattractive because of how they were when they were younger, right? So this is a type of cognitive conservatism, the idea that self-concept resists change, and we want to be careful of that, okay? So think about that in terms of yourself. When we have cognitive conservatism, where we're not allowing ourselves to assimilate positive information about ourselves or other people, there's a tendency that we will experience reduced happiness, the potential for delusions about ourselves or other people, and a lack of growth. And there also tends to be a tendency to feel defensive. Okay, so please do think about the self-concept and how it can resist change, and areas where this might apply in your life as well. A third self-concept characteristic is that culture shapes communication. Now, when we talk about culture, it's important early on in this class to distinguish between the difference of the difference between individual versus collective cultural values, right? So some of us, for example, were raised in households where it was encouraged or it was rewarded when we were accomplishing things, when we would set goals for ourselves that were, achievement oriented, when we would talk about those things and assert our own needs and our own will and what we needed or wanted in a situation. Those types of communication interactions are reflective of more individualistic cultural systems. On the other hand, some of us were raised in collective cultural systems where our behavior was rewarded when we were behaving in ways that reinforced the harmony of the group, that reinforced the positive future of the group, that reinforced the values of the group in which we lived in, whether it was a cultural group or a family group or a community group, whatever. So individualistic versus collective cultural systems are definitely worth considering. There's been a lot of research done in the intercultural communication area that distinguishes between different types of nations that are individualistic versus collective. So generally speaking, the research shows that the United States of America, places like Germany, places more in the northern European countries like Norway, Sweden, things like that, those cultures tend to be more individualistic. On the other hand, research has also found that cultures like in Latin America or Japanese culture, those kinds of Mexican American culture, that tends to be more collective. Now, culture is not the only component that deals with this individual versus collective dynamic. Like I said, you might actually be German American, but you might come from a family system where your family behaves in very collective ways. So it's really dependent on the family system that you were raised in and how your culture and your community interact. But we definitely want to be conscious of the fact that culture shapes communication. There is a definite difference between people who are emphasizing individual achievements versus collective achievements, collective harmony. And it's definitely worth considering that and thinking about where you fall on the spectrum. A fourth issue is that gender shapes communication. From a very early age, we tend to be socialized to our gender. Even when we are brought home from the hospital, girls tend to be brought home in pink blankets, boys tend to get blue blankets. If you go just walking down the toy aisle at any major department store, you will definitely see that boys and girls get very different types of toys with different types of colors, with toys that do different types of things, right? And there are values that are infused into these toys, right? So boy toys tend to be much more action-oriented, like trucks and robots and building stuff, right? Girl toys tend to be much more relationally oriented, like dollies or playing house or having a doll house or, having a little dolly that cries or a puppy that, that goes woof, woof and walks that you can control with a remote control, right? Those are relational characteristics that are basically gendered, right? So you can think about how gender was socialized in your own family. How were you socialized to your gender or your sex group, right? And since we're talking about gender and sex, it's probably good to distinguish the difference between sex and gender. And so for the purpose of discussion of, gender and sex identity, sex is basically the physical characteristics that we're born with, right? So you are born as a male or a female. There's really not much choice there, okay? However, gender is how we express our identity through communication, okay? So we all know that there are some men that are extremely macho, right? They tend to be very, kind of masculine, and they derive a lot of satisfaction from communicating that masculinity to other people. We also, know other people who maybe other men who are less macho, right? Maybe they're more intellectual or they're more into computer tech stuff, right? So this idea of gender is very important, and it also shapes how we communicate and the expectations we have in relationships. And another thing that's interesting with regards to gender is that women and men tend to identify with their sense of self and relationships differently. So, for example, self-esteem, and this is what this little link here says, self-esteem for men, okay, tends to be derived from their abilities and their accomplishments. All right, so men tend to get their sense of self-esteem from, what they can do, like building a house or having a good job where they can bring home lots of money, or having a nice car that indicates that they have a good job, right? Women, females, on the other hand, tend to derive their self-esteem from the relationships that they have with other people, right? So for women, if they are having relationship problems with their partner or with their family members or with friends, women are much more likely to internalize those problems and struggle emotionally, especially with self-esteem, than men when there are relational issues going on. So it's important to be aware of that as well. Now, in terms of socializing self-concept, this is a very important idea that all of us really want to be conscious of. And this idea of reflected appraisal was first developed by a man named Charles Cooley in 1912. And reflected appraisal is basically the idea that we take away ideas of who we are based on how other people see us, okay? So, for example, the way that my parents communicated with me when I was growing up about myself, so the ideas that they told me about who I am or who I was, are ideas that I internalized and then adopted in my own sense of self, right? And it's interesting to think about the fact that children are basically absorbing, right? From the minute that you bring them home, or the minute that the child is born, they're constantly absorbing information, and they internalize and assimilate that information into this sense of self, right? So children especially tend to be much more susceptible to embracing or internalizing positive and negative messages about themselves. So what this means is that if we are parents, or when we become parents, we really want to be very careful about the kinds of messages that we send our children, both in terms of verbal and nonverbal communication, okay? In addition, we also want to be careful about the kinds of messages that we talk about with regards to ourselves in front of the children that we have, okay? So for example, there's research on women and body image issues, and what the research shows is that women who grew up in environments or home environments where their moms had negative views of their bodies, so like let's say you're a young 5-year-old girl, right? And you constantly see your mom looking in the mirror, saying things like, oh my gosh, I'm so fat, or oh my gosh, I just can't seem to lose weight, or oh, this outfit just makes me look terrible, things like that. Those kids that grow up seeing their moms say those things will begin to internalize those messages as true for themselves as well. So it's not just the messages that parents directly tell their kids about their kids, but it's also the messages that the parents are internalizing in themselves, and children tend to adopt those messages as well, right? So significant others tend to have a very high value in terms of the messages that we internalize and that we tend to adopt. So it's important to think about that. Another type of self-concept issue that's relevant is this idea of social comparison. So I derive a sense of meaning about who I am based on other people, right? So we might compare ourselves to other people in terms of whether we're good looking or as good looking as them or not as good looking. We might compare ourselves based on whether, we're similar or different or superior or inferior, okay? But we can also have various notions of ourselves that are culturally bound. And I used the example of body image a few seconds ago, but this is a very culturally bound idea. Like what is considered to be beautiful in one culture might not be considered to be beautiful in another culture, somewhere across the world, right? So it's worth thinking about these issues. It's definitely worth considering the types of messages that you adopted about yourself and who you see yourself to be and whether that's accurate, right? And if it's not accurate, then you can certainly work to modify certain messages that are not serving you. If you feel like you're struggling with self-esteem issues, and by the way, most people will struggle with self-esteem at some point in their life, okay, depending on what happens in life. If you feel that you're struggling with self-esteem issues, I'm here to tell you that there's a lot that can be done to improve that. And you can work with a counselor on that. You can read lots of books about it. You can just work to become more conscious of that process as it's taking place in yourself, and you can work to start replacing negative messages with positive messages. And that will really go a long way in terms of helping you to enhance the relationship that you have with yourself. So with regards to the relationship we have with ourselves, one thing to be aware of is the tendency that people have to evoke what is called the self-fulfilling prophecy. The self-fulfilling prophecy is a process that takes place when we hold an expectation for ourselves. The self-fulfilling prophecy can also be something that plays out with regards to another person, so in a relationship, for example. And based on the expectation that we have, we behave according to what our expectation is. We behave in ways that align with the expectation that we have. And of course, based on our belief and based on our behavior, the expectation is usually fulfilled, okay? And so then once the expectation is fulfilled, there is a reinforcement of that expectation for future interactions, okay? So a good example of this would be, any kind of academic adventure, any kind of academic pursuit could definitely play out with the self-fulfilling prophecy. So for example, let's say you tend to be someone that doesn't really like history very much. So you have a history class you're taking right now at the university. So you go in and you hear that there's an exam happening, and you start to talk, you start to have the internal dialogue going. So maybe your internal dialogue sounds like this. Oh no, now I'm in this history class and I know what I used to do in terms of history tests in high school, and I have a really hard time remembering those events and all those dates and things like that. And I know it's going to be hard to do well on that test. And well, since I'm not going to do well on the test anyway, I might as well just not even study, because it doesn't really matter how hard I study on history. I can't seem to remember all those details anyway. So, of course, then you go in and you take your test, and because you haven't studied, you don't do well. And then, of course, the expectation is reinforced. But I think more relevant to an interpersonal comm class is the self-fulfilling prophecy that we take into relationships, okay? So, for example, some people have an attitude about themselves, okay, that's not true, but this is an attitude that tends to be developed very young, right? So let's take an example of a person, for instance, who has a attitude buried in their psyche somewhere, and that attitude is that they are not worthy of love, okay? So if somebody has gone through some very difficult childhood years and they didn't get what they needed from their parents growing up, it's likely that they will feel this lack of fulfillment or this perception that they're not lovable because they didn't get the love that they deserved when they were young. And there must be a reason for that, right? So people tend to adopt these attitudes sometimes without even being aware of it. And obviously having an attitude like that can lead to all sorts of destructive behaviors, right? So let's say we're working with the attitude of, oh, well, I'm not lovable. Okay, so there's an expectation that somebody has for themselves, but that is also an expectation that they have for other people, right? Because they expect that other people won't love them. And so it is a self and other expectation. Number two, based on their attitude of whether they're lovable or not, they might behave according to the expectation. So if you expect that you're not lovable, then you're not going to expect people to love you. And when they do behave in ways that are loving, you may not know what to do in that situation. You may behave in ways that sabotage the relationship rather than behaving in ways that promote or bring the relationship closer together, right, with people. So people might have that expectation. They might behave in all sorts of negative ways because they don't think that the person that they're, let's say, dating is going to stick around because they're not lovable anyway. And then, of course, over time, the relationship just gets too difficult for the other person, right? And so it's possible that the person may not stay in the relationship with the individual who feels that they're not lovable. And then, of course, that expectation becomes reinforced, right? So we can see how this self-fulfilling prophecy is not just something that deals with achievements, external achievements like education or work or things like that, but it also deals with the relationships we have as well. So make sure that you are conscious and you become conscious of some of these expectations and where you got them. A lot of the time we tend to get these expectations, as I said before, from our family systems, or from the media. The media is also a big promoter of attitudes about the self that are negative. Obviously, if the advertisement industry can convince me that I am not good enough the way that I am, then I will spend lots and lots of money trying to purchase products that will help me become lovable, right? So you can think about these things and how they relate to your own life as well. Another interesting prophecy or self-fulfilling effect is one that was developed by Rosenthal and Jacobson, and this is called the Pygmalion effect. And the Pygmalion effect is very closely related to the self-fulfilling prophecy, but there's one major difference. The major difference between the self-fulfilling prophecy and the Pygmalion effect is that the self-fulfilling prophecy primarily deals with the expectations that people have for themselves and how their own personal expectations shape the outcome that they experience. On the other hand, the Pygmalion effect deals with the expectations that other people have for other people, okay? So let's say the expectations that a teacher has for their students and how the expectation that the teacher has shapes the way that the student performs. So Rosenthal and Jacobson did a very interesting experiment in I believe it was in the late 70s. And what they did is they went into a classroom of second or third graders, and they wanted to know the effect that the teacher's expectations had on student performance. So what they did is they did a little experiment, okay? So they pulled the teacher aside at the beginning of the school year, and they told the teacher that a certain group of the students that she had or he had were gifted, right? So what they said was these students in particular, and they gave the teacher a list of student names or whatever, and they said these students are exceptionally intelligent, they are gifted, they tend to be above average, they tend to be very special, and the other students are just kind of average, okay? So then Rosenthal and Jacobson, of course, beforehand, they measured the students' test scores to see where the students fell in terms of standardized testing, right? Because this was an experiment. And so the control group were the students that were considered to be average, or the students that the teacher was told were average is the control group. And in this experiment, the students that were labeled as exceptionally intelligent or gifted was the other group, okay? And that was the group that they wanted to see the effect on. So Rosenthal and Jacobson did the testing. They informed the teacher of the competencies of her students, and then they basically just kind of let things play out for the next like 3, 4, or 5 months. Okay, so then they came back and they looked at the students' test scores. They looked at the students' grades and all these things on all these standardized measures. And what do you think they discovered? Well, if you're following along the way that I would be, what they discovered is that the students that the teacher was told were gifted ended up performing much more favorably on their grades. They ended up getting better grades. They had higher test scores than the students who the teacher was told were average. Okay, so based on the teacher's expectation for those students, and the students, by the way, were not informed either way. Okay, so the students did not have any clue probably that the experiment was even happening. Okay, so basically what ended up happening is the teacher who was told that these students are gifted ended up behaving in ways towards those students where the students took away the message that she had high expectations for them, right? The students that the teacher was told were average were also behaved or were also communicated with in ways where they took that away. They took away a message about what the teacher had in terms of expectations. So the power of these kinds of situations, whether we're looking at the self-fulfilling prophecy or the Pygmalion effect, the expectations that we have for ourselves, the expectations that other people have for us are very profoundly important in terms of beliefs we carry around and, of course, how we end up behaving. So please do think through these issues. If you have any questions about any of these issues, please let me know and I would be happy to discuss this with you further. So now that we've been discussing self-identity and sense of self and self-concept, some of us may have discovered that there are a few areas of self-concept that maybe we want to change a little bit, right? And I will say at this point in the lecture that I have worked on changing certain aspects of my self-concept over time as well, okay? So this is something that most people will probably do at some point in their life. Maybe it's not conscious, but you can certainly do it in a very conscious way as well. So if you realize that there is a part of your self-concept or maybe a part of your self-esteem that you want to improve, okay, or change, the first thing you want to do is have a realistic perception of yourself. So how do you achieve a realistic perception of yourself? Well, you can look at concrete things like, what do people tell you about yourself? People that you think know you well, like family, friends, significant others. You can also write down various activities that you spend your time doing, right? So if you tend to be somebody that spends a lot of time with your family, and you tend to spend time at church, and you tend to spend time dedicating volunteer hours, at the elderly home community, right? These are all very concrete things that you can write down about yourself, which give you a sense of who I am, right? So have a realistic perception of yourself. If you decide that you want to change any of your ideas of self, then you want to have realistic expectations. So what this means is you want to be conscious of the fact that you will probably need to work on changing your self-concept over time. It's not something that you can expect to have changed overnight, but it's good to have realistic expectations about what you are good at and areas maybe that you're challenged with, so that when you do tend to stumble a little bit, you can get yourself back up, dust yourself off, keep walking on the path you want to be on, and whatever ends up happening, do your very best to keep that internal dialogue or the internal voice positive, right? So you want to have positive ideas of yourself whenever possible. When negative things happen in life, make sure that you work to take care of yourself rather than beating yourself up and acting really self-critical, okay? So you can have a realistic expectation. You can have the will or the motivation to change, always a very important part of any process, having the motivation. And you can work to develop the skills to change, okay? Now, some of these skills are things that take time to cultivate. So, for example, if you tend to be very self-critical, it's going to probably take you some time to change that internal dialogue. But if you have a realistic perception of yourself, what that means is that when the negative voice kicks in, or the negative criticism or self-criticism kicks in, you can start to remind yourself of all the positive things that you know to be true about yourself, right? You can also remind yourself of all the positive things that other people have told you about yourself, okay? And that's one way that you can work to replace the negative self-critical voice with a positive self-encouraging voice, okay? There are several motivations for why we might manage our identity. For some of us, we may manage identity to start or manage our relationship. So, for example, when you go on a date for the first time, you're often engaging in what's called identity management. You tend to stylize yourself in certain ways. You tend to communicate in certain ways about certain topics, right? Also, we may tend to manage our identity because we want to try to gain compliance or get people to like us, right? We may also identity manage in order to save the face of other people, right? So, for example, if I have a conversation, let's say with a student, and let's say I'm having an interaction with a student in front of a class, and there's like, let's say 40 or 50 people in the classroom, and if the student says something that is not necessarily correct, rather than telling the student in front of 50 people, well, that's actually incorrect, and the correct terminology for that is this. I might not say that. In fact, I probably would not say that. What I would probably do instead is I might say something like, oh, well, that's a really interesting view on the issue, and we also want to consider this other perspective, okay? So in that situation, what I've done is I have saved the face of that student by not telling them that they're wrong in front of 50 people, right? So you can think about the way that you might manage identity to start or manage relationships, or to gain compliance and liking, or also to save the face of others. Identity management is certainly something that we're always doing. It's certainly an important skill to have, to know what's appropriate behavior when, and it's also something that we can work on if you feel as if you want to improve some aspect of this process. In terms of identity management, it's important to realize that people often construct multiple identities. So, for example, what that means is I'll use myself as an example. I have an identity as a professor, right? And so the way that I communicate and, let's say, stylize myself before I walk into a classroom to teach, I wear professional attire. I wear like a suit or a blazer. My hair is very professionally styled, things like that. I tend to communicate in a certain way when I'm teaching in front of a class full of students than I do when I'm at home in my pajamas talking with my husband before bed, right? So we talk and we communicate in very different ways depending on who we're talking with, depending on what our identity role is in that situation, right? Similarly, I would also communicate very differently to my students that are in their 20s, right, than I would to my kids, right? So if I had a child that was 2 or 3 years old, I would certainly communicate with them in a much softer, kinder, more simple way, right? Because it would be appropriate for their level of understanding. However, if I'm in a classroom with students who are 18 or 20 or 22, I'm going to use different terminology. I'm going to relate to them differently. So we basically have multiple identity hats that we wear, and we communicate differently depending on what identity hat we're currently wearing. Identity work is also collaborative. So what that means is that we help each other to achieve the identities that we put forth in life, right? So when you go on a date, for example, and let's say you've worked to make yourself look good and you smell good and you feel good, right? Things like that on a first date or maybe a second, third date, whatever, right? When you go on that date and your partner says to you, "Wow, you look really nice tonight." That's a collaborative interaction, right? I mean, if you can see that someone has obviously spent time, making themselves look nice for you on a date, right? And then the other person sees that and they identify that and they share the enjoyment or the appreciation that somebody went through to try to make themselves look nice, right? That's a very collaborative interaction, okay? So identity work is collaborative. And you can think of multiple situations in your life where this plays out. Identity management can be deliberate or it can also be unconscious, right? So sometimes people are very aware of the fact that they're managing identity. You might be walking in a certain way. You might, stylize your hair in a certain way or wear jewelry, that you like or whatever. On the other hand, people may not be aware of other things like nonverbal cues that they're giving off, right? So let's say you go up in front of a classroom to give a public speech. You might not be aware of the fact that you're slouching, or you might not be aware of the fact that you keep flipping your hair, right? Or you might not be aware of the fact that you have a weird, nervous twitch where you pull the side of your jacket every 3 seconds or something, right? So those are unconscious identity work issues, but other people will notice them even if we don't, right? And so it's important to become a good self-monitor so you're conscious of how you're communicating in what situations and what's appropriate in terms of certain situations, right? And dealing with what's appropriate, of course, here is the next term. Identity management varies by context. So as I said a second ago, when I'm communicating with my students in a classroom, I am going to communicate in very professional ways. I'm going to use language that is colloquial and standardized. I'm going to communicate in ways where I can facilitate conversations between students, right? Because a lot of my classes tend to be more discussion based. So I'm going to work to, help to collaborate and facilitate interactions. But, if you go home, let's say you're a student in a class at UI and you behave in certain ways that are professional in the classroom, that's great. That's appropriate. It's good that you're adapting. But if you go home for the weekend and you're going to watch some kind of a football game and you're sitting there with your sisters and brothers and you're, sitting around in your pajamas, you're going to be communicating very differently, right? So identity management is highly context specific, and it's important to be aware of all of these things. Finally, people vary in the degree of identity work that they're capable of achieving, right? So some of us are very good at managing our identity. Usually that's because we have had lots of experience in diverse situations where we've had to practice identity management. Other people you might meet are not very good at managing identity. So some people you meet, they might be the same person who says the same types of things in every single situation, and they do not modify no matter what. Now, for some people, that works okay because maybe they don't have aspects of their personality that need to be modified, right? But if you have someone, for example, who tends to be an oversharer, like people who give way too many details about personal issues in their life, that is something, for example, that you probably should work to manage, okay? Because, for example, when you go to a job and you're working with a customer, you can't be disclosing personal details that are inappropriate because it's just not professional, right? So people vary in their awareness of what's appropriate and in their ability to achieve that kind of identity management. So think about yourself in terms of where you fall on the identity management spectrum as well. Identity is managed through face-to-face interactions. So for example, some of us might be very socially warm or kind of socially engaging. Others might be more, short and to the point, right? Some people are they just don't say very much and they're not very friendly or warm. And that's a personal style issue, right? Identity management also deals with things like how do we dress ourselves? How do we decorate ourselves? You can also manage identity through how you decorate various settings that include territories that are yours. So you can tell a lot, for example, by what kind of car someone drives, or how they decorate that car, or what stickers they put on the car, or do they keep the car clean or not. You can also tell a lot by how somebody decorates their home or their office, right? These are all ways that we manage our identity. But we can also look at things like territory practices and how managing identity is happening all the time, even in places that are not necessarily, our personal spaces, right? So think of an example where you go to the library and, you're doing homework at a table there and you have the whole table to yourself and there's lots of tables open. So what do? Well, you're going to spread your stuff out at the library table, right? You're going to put the computer in front of you. You're going to put your bag next to you. You're going to put maybe a notebook across from you. You're going to try to let people know non-verbally that this is my table, right? And if somebody comes and sits at your table when there's lots of other tables open, you're going to look at them like, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? Because it's a bizarre response, right? So we have identity management that happens from face-to-face interactions. But we also have more mediated identity management. This can play out in terms of more written communication, or I would say technology communication as well. So things like print, like what kinds of font do you use, or signatures on your email, what kinds of Christmas cards do you send out, other aesthetic things like that. But more relevant to you folks is probably the computer-mediated interactions that we're using nowadays, right? So we have our personal web page, or like you all have probably a Facebook page, and on the Facebook page you have certain pictures. You might have your wallpaper, and then you have various quotes or books or movies that you've watched or bands that you like to watch. You might post links to concerts on there. These are all ways that we manage identity, right? You can also think about things like MySpace. I hear from students that MySpace is so yesterday and Facebook is totally in. So I don't think MySpace is really happening anymore, but these technology-mediated interactions in terms of identity are very relevant to consider. Another thing to consider in the modern technology world that we live in is the access issue. So, if you're applying for a job, for example, and you stylize yourself really professionally, you go into the job, you're wearing a suit, you do a really great job on the interview, and then you are waiting for a phone call to get the job offer, right? But it might be possible that on your web page for Facebook, your front web page, like your front picture, your profile picture, might have you engaging in, I don't know, some kind of like alcohol-based interactions, right? And maybe you guys had a really good time Friday night and you want to post that picture on Facebook, but, you need to be aware of the fact that employers more and more now are checking out people's public profiles to learn about them before they hire them. So that's important to be aware of whenever you post any kind of information that can be publicly accessible. One aspect of our self-concept that's important, and we're getting ready to wrap up in this lecture here, so I do appreciate your patience as we get through all of these important ideas. But one aspect of self-concept that's important, and we did talk a little bit about this at the beginning, are those messages that are positive about ourselves that we internalize. So ego boosters are messages about ourselves that enhance our experience, they enhance our ideas about ourselves, the views that we have, and they tend to generally positively contribute to how we experience our lives. On the other hand, ego busters are communication interactions that tend to detract from our experience. So think about your experiences growing up in the home, and think about the kinds of situations that you found to be encouraging or ego boosters. And then think about the kinds of situations that you found to be discouraging or situations that were ego busters. Also, think about the ways in which those types of interactions have shaped who you've become and the attitudes that you've adopted about your own competencies and your own skills, okay? Because a lot of these ideas, as I said at the beginning of the lecture, ideas that we hold about ourselves are socialized at a very young age. So now that we're adults, it's our responsibility to start to unpack these issues a little bit more, to start to realize, okay, well, where did I get these ideas? Which ideas about myself serve me well and which don't? And do I want to modify or, remediate some of these issues so that I'm a happier person, okay? So ego boosters and ego busters are definitely important to consider and relevant in any kind of discussion on socializing self-concept, okay? Thank you very much for your attention on this lecture. As you'll see when I click into the next couple of slides, there are several links here at the end of this PowerPoint show, which are not required for you to listen to a review, but if you feel like you want to, just to get more information about some of the ideas that we're talking about here, please feel free to listen to any of them or all of them. However, you will not be expected to listen to the viewing or listening clips that are included on the PowerPoint for tests or anything like that, but it might be very interesting to you to listen to some of them, because what they do is they provide good examples of some of the topics that we're talking about in here. If this class was taking place in person, I would probably be playing some of the clips that you see at the end of the PowerPoint slideshow. So I do encourage you to at least check out maybe one of them that looks interesting to you. However, you certainly are not required to do that, okay? Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your consideration of these important issues. And I will talk to everyone again in Chapter 3. And please, of course, let me know if you have any questions about course material. I'm very happy to answer those questions. And I'm happy to be your resource as we learn more about self-identity and interpersonal communication. Have a great rest of the week.